I'm pretty sure that we are now talking about the worst subject ever. I'm sure most of you already don't like radicals, but now we're going to add to it what we call complex numbers. Hey guys, this is Mastats. Welcome back to this channel. Um, Before we move on, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you can always get an alert when I post a new video, as well as check out my other channels as they are appearing on the screen. You can always donate to my Cash App, PayPal, and Zelle. They are all in the description down below. Without further ado, let's get active. Today, guys, we are going to talk about complex numbers. How many of you like complex numbers? Pretty sure the answer is 0. But guess what? We have to talk about complex numbers. So I want you guys to follow as you see the pictures on the screen. I'm going to look at the definitions of those and explain how it works. So we have, first of all, the definition of the square root of negative a. If a is a positive real number, then the principal root or the principal square root of negative a is the imaginary number I square root of a. Namely, it's written as the square root of negative a equals to I square root of a. What does that mean? The reason why it is called imaginary, and I actually alluded to that previously in one of our other videos. The reason why it is imaginary is because in a square root, you see, this is a square root, meaning it's an even square, or it's an even root. You cannot take the negative root of an even root. Meaning, when you, for instance, if I have 2 power of 2, that equals to 4. So I can take the square root of 4, right? That will be equal to plus or minus 2. Why is it plus or minus 2? Because if I take negative 2 and I also square it, I'll get 4. But the funny thing is, you cannot take the negative, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. Why? Because that's why it's called square root. So if you think about it, you see, when you square 2, you get a positive 4. When you square negative 2, you get a positive 4. So if you square any number, so if you square 2, you cannot get negative 4. So that's why you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So let me say it again. You cannot take the square root of a negative number, because when you square a number, it always comes out positive. So that's why if you take the square root of a negative number, it is imaginary, because it is not a real number. Let's move on. Let's talk about the definition of a complex number. A complex number is a number of the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers and I, which is equal to the square root of negative 1, the number a is the real part of a plus bi, and b is the imaginary part. So again, the real number is a. The imaginary number is the b. So what does that basically mean? It means that for any number, when you have, like, let's say you have 2x, well, the variable is called x, and 2 is called the coefficient. Well, the thing for imaginary number is I simply means the square root of negative 1. But this is not the imaginary number. This is basically the variable. the imaginary number is actually the number that is in front of I, because it is that number that is negative under an even root. And because you cannot have a negative number under an even root, either square root, fourth root, sixth root, that means this number is imaginary. And the way we write imaginary number is the number b, or number f, or a, whatever number it is, with the I, meaning this number here should be treated as an imaginary number. I hope that makes sense. And let's move on to the next one. Let's add and subtract complex numbers. So when it comes to addition and subtraction of complex numbers, to add two complex numbers, you just have to add the real parts and add the imaginary parts. Or the same way, to subtract two complex numbers, you subtract the real parts and subtract the imaginary part. For instance, let's say we have, I'm gonna do this. Let's say we have 2 plus 5i minus 2 plus 3i. Well, what it's gonna be is 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. 5 plus 2 is equal to 8. So that we basically, we would write 8i, but to make it more clear, it would be a 0 plus 8i. Same way, if you have 5 minus 3i minus 3 plus 2i, well, that would be 5 minus 3 is equal to 2 minus, that would be I. So that's how you would add or subtract real complex numbers, basically. Next thing we can talk about multiplying complex numbers. So when you multiply complex numbers, what do you do? This one is actually very interesting. You remember we talked about that when we were doing the radicals, that when you multiply two radicals, it is what you can do something as follow, right? You remember that the square root of a times square root of b is equal to square root of a times b, right? Remember that? So in complex numbers, you can't do that like that. I mean, you can, but it is not the best way to do it. So what you need to do first is, when multiplying square roots of negative numbers, first rewrite the radical expressions using I. So meaning, let's say I have the square root of negative 4 times the square root of negative 8. Well, instead of doing the square root of 32, that would be wrong, because that's not what they are doing right now. So in this case, what you're going to do is, first, you're going to do the square root of negative 4 is basically, this is basically square root of negative 1 times 4, right? Times the square root of negative 1 times 8, right? And that would be equal to the square root of negative 1 times square root of 4 times square root of negative 1 times square root of 8. Well, that would be equal to, this is going to be equal to I square root of 4 times I square root of 8. And we know what square root of 4 is equal to 2. So it will be 2i times square root of 8. You know what this, you know that square root of 8 is equal to 2 square root of 2. So that would be equal to basically 2i square root of 2. So that's how you would actually multiply them. And then once you do that, what do you get next? You get what? You get, so 2 times 2 equals to 4. I times I equals to I squared and square root of 2, right? And what is I squared? I squared equals to negative 1. So that means you would have negative 4 square root of 2. And that's how you would multiply to complex numbers. Let's move on to the last one, dividing complex numbers. Well, when you're dividing complex numbers, what happens is a fraction containing one or more complex numbers is in its simplest form when no imaginary number remains in the denominator. So the same way when you are doing radicals, if you have a radical under the denominator, it is not into its simplest form. It is the same way for the complex numbers. You cannot have an imaginary number under the denominator. Why? Because you cannot divide by an imaginary number. So we're gonna do some exercise in the next video where you guys gonna be understanding, or you guys gonna understand exactly what this means. And I'm gonna try to make it as easy as possible. So stay tuned for that, and don't go too far, because next thing you're gonna find is the videos on the examples in complex numbers. Guys, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. Also, check out my links below: PayPal, Zelle, and Cash App. Donate to the channel, and you can check out my other channels as they are popping on the screen as well. Guys, I'm gonna stop it right here. This is Masters, and I hope to see you guys again. Until then, Masters out.